Okay, all right. So, welcome. I usually start a bit later, but anyway, okay. Okay. Well, anyway, so welcome everybody to another Next Now event. Usually we have these meetings about quarterly with Next Now. There's a foundation created for interesting scientific and like-minded people to focus on interesting topics. It was partly started to celebrate the works of Doug Engelbart, and we know him from such things as the mouse and other things such as the mother of all demos. Right. So he made a great impact on many of us, and we like to try and think of him every time we have these meetings. So Kennan is a wonderful scientist. She has many, many interesting contributions to science. There are too many for me to list. She sent me a bio, and it's incredibly detailed in many categories, which she will allude to during her talk. She is an executive co-director of the nonprofit ReImagine Science, based in DC. She co-founded it in 2018 to do what she says is redo the science of thinking of how we do science in the US. And I think it's interesting to say do, because it's really how we conceptualize science and how we educate science and how we talk about science, which is a very important and very strategic contribution to all of us in the STEM space. So I think I'd like to say that she's a wonderful human, and she's worked in many parts of science and technology, and she will allude to this during her presentation. And her extensive work has also been focused on bringing TED to various places in the Northern California area, especially in working on inviting small science sizing to the stage on the areas of ideas worth sharing. And she has an idea worth sharing with us today about reimagining science. So I'd like to pass over to Kennan to begin talking about how she thinks about science.
Excellent. And Joy, thank you also for trying to shave a little bit of time off of my age. We actually founded in 2008, not 2018, but I'll take that 10 years back. And also, just to let everyone know, so first of all, thank you, Joy, for inviting me, and Bill Dahl, over many years you've mentioned this, and Dan for the three of you helping me to set this up. I will say that as soon as I start sharing my slides, I won't be able to see anything, so I'll be relying on you, Joy, to jump in if something's not working. You'll just let me know by speaking up. Also, the talk is a bit of a whirlwind. I will try to pause and go more slowly in the parts that really have ideas that I want to make sure land. But most of the conversation is actually for the question and answer. So I'm very much looking forward to a conversation based on what I hope are some provocative ideas that I will share. So with that, let me begin. Okay, so the name of the talk is actually Collective Practices for Transforming What It Is to Be a Scientist. And I will be going over a few of those. But first, I want to talk a little bit about science as an occupation. And this will be focused in large part on the life sciences. But I'm just going to read this quote. I think it's terrible to tell people to go into science when there are no jobs out there. PhDs are in bad shape when it comes to jobs. I was told that America needed Americans to go into science, so I did, and it has been the most frustrating experience of my life. There are days when I wished I'd never picked up a beaker. This is from 1995. One could say that maybe that was an era. There was something going on with the job market. I'll be speaking to this more in a few minutes. But this question of whether science has been calcified is from a report that came out in 2018 from the National Academies of Science about the life sciences. And the president of Johns Hopkins, Ron Daniels, said, there have been warning signs for years that the US biomedical enterprise may be calcifying in ways that create barriers, in particular for the incoming generation of researchers. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my own background in science. In my early years in life, we sort of bounced around the country. My parents were in civil rights, but landed in New Mexico when I was 8. When I was in high school, I was invited to apply to be part of the first female class at West Point, but I was too young. I was going to have to wait too long to start. So instead, I went to the local college, Eastern New Mexico University, graduating summa cum laude with a chemistry degree when I was 18 years old. I would say straight out of college, but actually the job was given to me straight out of college, but I had to have a security clearance, a Q clearance that was a fairly high level clearance at Los Alamos Labs. It took almost a year to get. So I hung out in Alaska for a while where my mom lived. But when I finally did get there, I worked on an inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectrometer, a prototype that had been built by a scientist that had worked there. And this is an argon plasma torch that is so hot that it will atomize any molecular structure to its elemental particles, or elements rather. And as the electrons that are excited assimilate back down to their ground state, they emit specific wavelengths of light. So it's amazingly perfect for analyzing all of the elements, nearly all the natural occurring elements of the periodic table. And so ground, water, every square mile of the US was being analyzed by this inductively coupled plasma when I was working at Los Alamos. After that, I went to Livermore Labs, where I worked on protein structures for DNA scaffolding. These particular proteins seen in the second cartoon from the left are perfectly positioned for neutralizing all of those phosphates in the backbone of DNA, stacking DNA up like cordwood, where it's most concentrated, those information pellets called sperm, where it's almost strictly DNA and these protamine proteins that neutralize it and almost nothing else in the cell. From there, I went into graduate school where I studied the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, getting a degree in chemistry with a focus in protein chemistry, looking at the disulfide structure and carbohydrate structure. From there, I did a postdoc in University of Massachusetts Medical Center, looking at how proteins are secreted out of the cell, which is a very basic biophysical question. How can proteins that have all kinds of amino acids, all kinds of charges, in some kind of generic way, make it out of the cell in a very highly controlled manner, because you cannot have movement of ions or water or anything else. It's a very controlled environment. So a very good mystery, still not solved. After that, I continued that work at Georgetown University in the Department of Chemistry, but left academia after a little over 5 years and went to Celera when they were doing the human genome. My job at Celera was to explain how whole genome shotgun sequencing worked. We also did beta testing in-house, and I also trained scientists at various facilities on how to interpret the data, how to use the genome browser, and I was involved in the launch of the genome browser, where you get to look at all of the DNA in the human genome. After that, I got to look at all of the DNA in a small soil microbe called Dichloromonas aromatica. And this was a project that I took on under the aegis of a friend at UC Berkeley, also working at Joint Genome Institute, which is one of the sequencing centers of the 5 that exist in the world. And one of the reasons that I really love this job, besides the fact that looking at protein sequence, at DNA sequence, and then the expected protein sequence from that is like being in heaven for a protein chemist. I mean, that's what you absolutely want to know, is the sequence of the proteins. And I was able to bring over the hidden Markov model pipeline that I had become so impressed by at Celera Genomics. Kim Scholander, by that time, who had originated that process, was at Berkeley as well. And it's a form of artificial intelligence that allows you to scaffold proteins that have similar function to be able to predict the functionality of novel proteins. And I spent about 5 years actually going through all 4,000 or so proteins of this particular life form to predict what their function was. This is a cartoon that I created for a publication looking at the different kinds of lifestyle functions this soil microbe was able to undergo by predictive analysis. However, I'll say something in just a moment about where that really led me. So the next place I was co-founder of ReImagine Science, because when I was doing the genomics project and I was using hidden Markov models to assemble proteins into functional families, it pulls from the whole universe of all sequenced proteins, all sequenced genomes around the world. And this was in the fairly early stages, though it had already been exponentially growing for a handful of years, of genomics and genome sequencing. And we were making a mess of it. We were making an absolute mess of protein annotation pipelines. I could see as I was pulling in proteins in these aligned sequence assemblies that I started being able to identify just by the sequence identifier which sequencing center it had been sequenced at, because different sequencing centers were using different pipelines for analysis. And the pipelines often were low-hanging fruit that were a fairly crude way of aligning proteins, and proteins were getting called different names by different sequencing centers. The data was becoming hash. And I went on the bandwagon about this. I actually went to NSF with my laptop and my spreadsheets and my histograms and just showing, you know, if I were sequenced in Japan, you would be calling my proteins this, and nobody would actually know because they do a blast and they would land in the wrong section. And I also talked to people at different sequencing centers about working together on a common pipeline, and I would get replies such as, well, if I help this other sequencing center, I might lose my funding. And so I found that the actual structure of science was the thing that was in the way of making our breakthroughs in discovery at the meta level of analysis, not the actual science itself. But something else was happening at the same time. My neighbor and friend, Joan Steeper, was in charge of the Delta Smelt breeding program with UC Davis. And in conversations with her, I was really shocked to find that in the early 2000s, Delta Smelt populations crashed by 85 to 90%. And they weren't sure why. They sort of hobbled along. There was a little bit of an upswing, but they've actually now been declared extinct because they can't find any in the Delta. And this is a feeder species for a whole complex ecosystem in the California Delta, which is a huge waterway. In fact, I found one article looking for this figure for the talk from the Wall Street Journal, somebody saying, hey, they're extinct. Why are we even looking out for the Delta Smelt or the Delta region ecologically anymore? They're not even here anymore. Why are we worrying about it? Not only are Delta Smelt extinct, but when we were doing our different events, I started reading different books about wild Atlantic salmon, cod. I then found out that most of the major land mammals had dropped by 85 to 90% in population levels. We're going through a major crisis on the planet in non-human species. And I used to say, if you were a cod, you didn't have to worry about whether or not claims of climate change were true or not. 90% chance you were already dead. So I want to say some things about reimagining science now. This is the report that I quoted from earlier, Daniel Roberts. We were founded over a decade ago by Ph.D. scientists, myself and my co-founders, who really wanted to see a paradigm shift in the way we do science, because we think that the culture, the structure, and policies in particular of the scientific enterprise are really due for transformation. When this report came out in 2018, they cited reports that I'm going to be talking about later, but from 2000, from 2005, 2012, 2014, saying, look, this is number 7 in a long line of reports. We don't want it to be just another report. We really would like to see change. Some of the suggestions are actually, I think, very good suggestions. Responsibility from all levels and institutions, transparency regarding outcomes, transparency in data sharing is always good. Don't train only for academic careers, and experiment. However, what I found is that what's said versus how we're actually going about it are two different things. So in science, the culture of science, we are following a policy that was created right after World War II. And this policy was created because of the rise in power of the United States by having an atomic bomb during World War II. And so Vannevar Bush put forward that we should exponentially grow our academic science departments, starting with physics and engineering. In the 70s, it moved into life sciences, and marrying the attainment of the Ph.D. and where basic research was happening with exponential growth of the academic enterprise. And that worked for a little while. But exponential growth only works for a little while. So it's time for a new policy because the world is changing and we've hit the limits of this particular structure. I will say actually as well, Joy, you had asked me about what are the histories of science? And to me, there are three arcs of science. One is about a 4,000-year history, which is the rise of patriarchy. Another is about a 400-year history, which is the rise of thinking through the paradigm of being external to the system and being logical and having a particular way of going about discerning through logic and through theory. And then the most recent one is this after World War II, instigated by Vannevar Bush. And we're at the nexus of all three of those arcs. In fact, this nexus has me definitely asking the question, who do we work for? Who creates the work in science? And what is the purpose of this work? What are we focusing on? And I will tell you, the millennials are worried. They're worried about the future of the planet. They're worried about their children and their children's children. They're worried about life on the planet, and they're worried about the future. In systems thinking, there's no out there. We can't just keep throwing things into the environment and creating waste and creating microchemical climates and putting things off to the future. It's actually all here where we are in the system that we are part of. And a good environment, not only on the planet, but also at work and in life, is keenly wanted by the next generation of scientists. It's not a closed system of decision-making, but an open system of co-creation. So you might ask, what is this science I'm talking about? Joy, as you pointed out, for many of you, especially if you're in the IT industry, there's a lot of scientists, they come in, they get hired, they get great salaries, life is good. But the IT and computer industry have an oversized impact on the narrative around STEM in this country. The figure on the left is from 2015, and if you look at the lower blue bar, it's computer occupations, and then after that, engineers. I updated the data to the most recent data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on the right. This is from a spreadsheet I created. I have a little bit different categories, but mostly the same. Computer information systems and computer occupations are over half of the STEM identified jobs in the United States. And after that, it's engineering. And after that, it's sales reps. And then there's a kind of a small slice up there that's about 1.5% of STEM jobs. That's big pharma. That's the small dark blue stripe. Life sciences, academia, PhD researchers, they're one of these tiny slices up here, like 1 out of 1,000 STEM jobs. But our narrative is if you're smart and you like science and you're good at math, you should become a scientist because America needs you. So we've ended up with a situation for postdocs that's really untenable. We've created this conversation about the alternative career landscape. And this is from the movie Beetlejuice. The alternative career landscape is presuming that they're going to be like Sergey, last name I've forgotten, who started Google, like 23andMe, the wife of one of the Google founders who started that, where there's a whole lot of money and you create a successful enterprise. But I've been a mentor for the UC Davis entrepreneur boot camps, at the Stanford entrepreneur boot camps. I've been involved or witnessed rather the UCSF boot camps that Steve Blank designed, that I-Corps at National Science Foundation adopted. And this landscape is just full of dangers. They're trying to get postdocs who are at the top of their field. When you are a postdoc, you have studied your specific area of research where you are the world's expert in that area of research. And then we're saying, all of that's well and good. Now go do something else. And we partner them up with a business school student and a PI, and we say, go invent something. Science is far more complex than what most postdocs will be able to create with just two co-founders trying to look for an idea. And I found that, at least at UC Davis, a lot of these ideas that they would land on were something that they could create now, like fresh juices or lunch packs delivered to your door. They're not at all at the level of research that they left academia at. What this results in for this next generation is that they really want to address existential issues. They came to make a contribution. And the policymakers actually have a phrase for them of being welfare queens in white lab jackets, as if they feel entitled, but they're just trying to make a difference. And it's led to shame and grief in this population because they feel like they have done something wrong. So Ron Daniels, president of Johns Hopkins, lead author of that 2018 National Academies report, asks us to take a systems perspective. And I agree. Alan Leshner, who's the author of a report that came out the same year around life sciences, talks about prototyping, entrepreneurship. It's a really good start, but it needs to be broadened. We really need to ask the big questions. Where are we going and who's going with us? So I'm going to talk a little bit through a systems lens now. In this systems lens, this is Kennan. I'm going to take just a few minutes on this slide, and then I'm going to do kind of a whirlwind through the next few slides, but you'll be able to stick with me. But this is a particular framework for decision making, and David Snowden has categorized any kind of decision domain in 4 different areas. Clear on the lower right means that it's really easy to take in the data, see what's going on, sense it, you categorize it, so you figure out what it's calling for, and then you respond. Very simple, very clear. Complicated is where most of us live. So you read the data, you analyze it, so it might be really, really complicated, lots of moving parts, like building a jet plane, and then you respond. Complex is where you probe. You actually don't know because it's a changing landscape. And so I'm going to talk through the lens of complexity and self-organizing systems a little bit. And then chaotic is when all hell has broken loose. And we've been having that from time to time in society, as you all well know. I'm going to go through a bit of probing that we did as ReImagine Science. We were founded in 2008 in Washington, D.C. And one of my early discoveries was from Silicon Valley in the IT industry. That actually there was this whole movement, and engineers are actually quite different than scientists. And this movement was to figure out what it takes for people to get along together. So the McCarthys in particular were one of my first forays into this mindset. They had worked for Microsoft for a number of years and ended up doing team training after they had great success with creating Visual C++. And their training involves artwork, poetry, checking in so that you define your emotions anytime you go into a meeting, or you can pass. So it's a way of non-dominance because you have agency, and also self-reporting, self-inquiry. So we did a good bit of inquiry. I'm going to go through just some slideshows. You don't have to really pay attention to the details, but we started in 2010 as part of the first USA Science and Engineering Festival in Washington, D.C., using open space, which allows the questions within the community to arise through the process. We did another one in 2012. We did another one in 2013 out on the West Coast at the Presidio. In this one, we were looking at mapping the systems of science and technology to figure out what kinds of structures there were, what kinds of structures were changing. We ended up featuring different tools for teamwork, and it turns out the person who came from Genentech came to me afterwards and said, oh, we launched our program in this very same building. I thought that was pretty cool. And interestingly, Genentech did their training and teamwork in the IT department of Genentech. It actually wasn't for the scientists. So part of my lens of looking through the lens of complexity and self-organizing also includes looking at our system as a fractal. Myself and my co-founders believe ourselves to be a fractal of the scientific community at large. My way of thinking of this is as within, so without. The way that you behave, the way that you are with yourself and with others will affect what you produce out in the world. One of my favorite stories about this, in terms of complexity and self-organizing, came to me via Doug Kirkpatrick, pictured on the right here. He and Chris Rufer founded Morningstar, which does tomato processing, and Chris Rufer, a libertarian, early on in their formation realized that there was a lot of extra work just based on not having trust. So he decided we need a trust-based environment. So they structured their whole company around two rules. No person dominates another, and you keep your word. There are no bosses at Morningstar, haven't been for decades. They're self-organized, self-managed, and it's a flat structure. And I figure if they can do it for tomatoes, maybe we can do it for science. This is just to convince you that science and scientists are part of nature. And nature works by simple rule sets too. A very simple set of rules for the pattern you see on the right. And this is just as cells progress through iterations of a rule change on whether they change from black to white or back, can make very complex patterns, which is reflected in nature. Cell development works by these same kinds of rule sets. I think humans do too. What other kinds of probing did we do as ReImagine Science? These are the collective practices. We did living room salons. This was with my friend Linda Staley, who founded the Global Collab Network. A lot of these were in DC because she used to work in policy in the Office of Science and Technology and also for the White House. So we would gather different policymakers and have conversations in her living room. And then we had some on the West Coast too. We also have created something we call Third Space, which is an interactive dialogue that has a co-creative event at the end. Everyone is designed specifically for that audience. We've done several of those over the years. And in fact, this is one of the real rich tools that we have in our tool belt. And I also keep in touch with the younger generation. So Gabe Lee on the left came to us through Volunteer Match several years ago when we were looking for a secretary of the board. He was just starting his sophomore year at high school, so he wasn't legally allowed to be on our board. So instead, he and his friend Polly became advisors to ReImagine Science, created their own ReImagine Science Club at Dougherty High School. We had weekly conversations all the way through their high school years, and I'm actually due to talk to them this weekend, but I think it will be next weekend. So we stay in touch even now. They're juniors in college. Also, and David's here today, in the K through 12 space. So this push for STEM training and being good in STEM and being good in math has a huge effect in the K through 12 environment. I find that people define themselves as either STEM ready or avoiding STEM. And I love working with David because he's looking at the whole child and looking at what are all the attributes needed for a child to succeed going into life. And I believe that everyone has science in them. Science I define as curiosity. This is educating for careers, and there's a big push for a lot of those science jobs that are defined as science. They do take math, they do take logical thinking, but they might even be in construction. And so there's a whole conversation about culture that we could have too. All right, so I'm getting close to the end here. We also have been doing a lot of work with Theory U as a member of the U Lab, going through their own growth process. This is a retreat we had at Estes Park using their social presencing theater techniques, which are really cool because you are thinking through your body instead of just your brain. We launched our U Lab learning journey for scientists at the Science of Team Science in 2017. We reconvened, and Mehdi is here. So that was Mehdi in that slide. And then on the lower right, we did a workshop there that I would say they were really ready for, but they didn't know they were ready for it. We continued the experiment by being one of the first entries into the Societal Transformation Lab, where we looked at the ocean academia interface, ending up with a 3D mapping project at Bodega Marine Labs. And as Joy pointed out, I have found the TEDx platform to be an excellent one for getting ideas out. So I started in Livermore in 2013 with their TEDx event. I've done several there. This is when I went to TED Summit and actually hosted a session using social presencing theater to look at science and heresy. Right now, what we've been doing for the last 2 years is our own learning journey outside of the ULab structure, because I realized we needed something more specific for scientists, and I want to draw your attention to the very bottom here. These are different snapshots. When we did our retreat, it was going to be at the 1440 Multiversity in Central California, and the date was March 20th, 2020. So 1 week before California went to shelter in place, we converted to an online workshop instead. The workshop was, I thought, going to help us ideate a training for the scientist of tomorrow. We found that we needed to go deeper. We met bi-monthly for 1.5 years, and where that's gotten to now is a subgroup of that learning journey group, which was about 12 people, and Bill Dahl was involved in the first part of that, have now put in a proposal because we found that there's a confluence between the way we have been looking at the system through a systems view lens and indigenous wisdoms. One of our members is full-blooded Seneca, but we've also invited in and been introduced to Ken Paul, another person of indigenous descent. And we've found something very interesting here. This is the model that he uses to look through systems using this particular 4 directions diagram. And we had head, heart, and hand. He has spiritual on there too. Okay, I'm just going to go through a real quick time thing. I'm going to go very quickly here. These are reports. And they're all kind of on the same thing. And hopefully you notice those years. We're counting backwards all the way to 1969 about issues where the beating heart of science is, which is the postdoc and PhD community. So I started asking through the Kennan lens about this issue of why these issues of how we train our scientists and having them sort of jump off a cliff when they're finally good and trained. Why has that stuck around for so many decades? And I said, oh, this is a chaotic situation. But in the workshop, it was pointed out to me, well, first of all, I thought, oh, maybe it was pointed out chaotic is something that's very short term. Decades, that's not short term. So I thought, oh, complex. This is complexity. It's self-organizing. It's around a very messy, wicked problem kind of thing. Nope. It's around policy, and that's over in the complicated. Lots of rules, lots of bureaucracy. So this is where our focus is now. And I'm going to say one thing that's very interesting about Ken Paul's model is that he sees stuck places as often, especially for the environment, is often being over where culture exists. And on his 4 directions mapping, that's in the world of spiritual. How interesting. So I think with that, I'll end. I have a couple more things I can show, but I think I'd really love to get into questions.
Well, thank you, Kennan. What an amazing story you tell of where science is today, especially far-reaching and wide-reaching and deep-reaching. Thank you so much for that perspective. I do think it'd be interesting for us to know, is there anything you think we can do to help? or a mission we can take forward in our jobs, because we're probably more aligned with IT than the natural sciences, as you would say.
Yeah, and life sciences and environmental sciences do have an effect on all of us, because it's our health and also the planet we live on.
Yeah.
So it's the place that all the IT specialists work, on planet Earth. So I think what I'd really love is a discernment. Next time you hear a narrative about how we need more STEM workers, be discerning about what is that conversation really and what's driving it.
Yeah. I completely agree. I didn't realize it was that dire, actually. Thinking of STEM, I always think, oh, good, we've got lots of people, we care about it. But I think the broadening of that view is incredibly important. I'd love to have questions. I don't know how to do this, because I was hoping people would actually type some questions into the chat, and then we could sort of control the flood of questions. Oh, good. Zan, of course, has come up with a question, which is terrific. And I will try and let Zan say that question instead of me reading it. So then I can, if all other people put their questions in, then we can know how many people have questions and make sure we get to everybody, okay? So Zan, why don't you take it from here?
First, Kennan, this was really fascinating, and just so many things that after all these years that I really didn't know about your work and the source of your work. And so just really thank you. Very provocative. I'm curious, you just briefly referred to the scientific paradigm of being objectively outside the system that you're studying, and then you just moved right on over that. And that, of course, is our probably biggest paradox, because we really are not outside the systems that we're studying. And I think that subjective objective cycle of influence is probably very foundational for the work that you're doing. Curious to hear more.
Absolutely. Love the question. Also, I want to point out both Mary Miguez, who did the introduction to social presence in theater and so much rich work with us, is here, as is David Militzer, who worked in the K-12 space and invited me into his space a handful of years ago. And Ken Hallenbach, who's secretary of our board, recently left Genentech for the East Coast and was at UCSF when they have a couple of generations of cohorts of postdocs and PhD students. He was a PhD student there in the top life science department in the country that have been activists. So you have resources besides just me answering this question, but I will take this question and then actually curious if Mehdi wants to add a little bit to it. So this is a paradigm shift, absolutely. One of the key aspects of Otto Scharmer's theory U is that you turn the lens onto yourself. If you're looking at what's going on in the outside world, you look inside first. Who are you being? What are your belief systems? You do a self-inquiry. And in science in particular, this idea of the outside observer has already been crumbling. One very clear outward sign of this is John Ioannidis' work around how the scientist is inherently within the system. He looked at 70,000 different clinical trials and disaggregated the data to show how each and every step of a clinical trial process had the human in the system that was thwarting the data, if you will. And so he came out with a very provocative phrase that clinical trials and medical outcomes were more likely to be wrong than right. So this is the whole replication crisis that we've been in for about a decade. Mm. So scientists are in fact part of the system.
Mm. So Jean, is Jean on? Jean Fox, is she gone?
I'm here, yes. Yeah. I just watched this TikTok the other day that Kennan's slide was showing how simple things can be. This TikTok video is about how you replicate this simple process. The triangle will, and you're just using this one step repeated over and over and over again, it creates multiple triangles. I think we make things so complicated, and our government systems, like, seems every time we turn around, we're in a roadblock and they're just not working.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the beauty also of TikTok. It limits what you can do. And if you'd explain that product to people, they'd say, well, it only does this. But the beauty of it is that it only does this. And I think in my business, everybody wants to make more features, more capabilities, and trying to sell people on less is a very, very difficult thing to do, as I've been doing since I was born, it seems like. But it's easy to put more in. Taking things out is not an advertising, marketing role that we buy into. They want to do more, 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 but less, less, less is never easy to sell.
Well, it's all getting too complicated, and you're just everything's shutting down because it's so complicated.
Yeah, yeah.
In so many sectors.
Yeah, I agree. Completely.
We're getting overwhelmed. We're all going to just jump ship.
Yeah. But now we're gonna have the metaverse now as well, which is going to make it even more leery, and difficult. So anyway, so has anyone else got?
Lauren has one, and Lauren, I've queued up actually my next slide because of Lauren's question. So Lauren.
Okay, great. I don't see it in the chat, so I can't help. Lauren.
Yes, I'm sorry about the fuzzy screen. I will correct it. It just appeared with this Zoom. What I said to Kennan, because I put it directly to Kennan because I thought that's what you wanted, Joy. So what I said is valuable presentation. Your ending landed on the impact of culture. It seems to be the main impactor, though rarely recognized. What are some of the efforts being done to correct negative cultural impacts, gender issues, diversity issues, etc.?
That's a big one.
All right, here we go. I'm going to share and go into slide view.
Wow.
Yeah, those are my other slides. You already saw them. So I have my own theory on this, and I'm also seeing the next question as well that's going down this road. I had been introduced to Thomas Hübel's work probably in 2012 or so at the, I want to say, Bay Area Integral, yes, when Terry Patton was still with us. And Thomas was talking at the time about the space between, and I was in a training in communication about the space between two people, the way communication happens. It's not just your ear getting it in and your mouth saying something out. And Thomas has, maybe he was already there back then, though it wasn't evident at all, but he has very much landed in the area of trauma and where trauma has gotten current culture and society. His lens of how trauma informs organizations, governments, policies, families, individuals, takes on the premise that trauma is multi-generational. It's built into society, it's built into colonialism, it's built into racism, it's both a symptom and a creator of this very fractured world that we live in at this time. And having been the last 2 years more intensely involved in his trauma-informed leadership work, I think that the place that we can look at for systems approaches, efforts being done to correct negative cultural impacts, we actually have to go back to the core seed, which is trauma. One of the things when I started ReImagine Science, I was looking at gender difference outcomes in science, and I realized, oh, it's a whole system. It affects everybody. There's a particular thing that happens for women in science, but it affects men as well. It just has a different kind of effect. And these kinds of belief systems and structures are, I believe, typically in response to usually even multi-generational trauma. So that's my answer to what I think good effort will be in producing a changed outcome, because we've been doing the same efforts over and over again. Notice those reports, we're getting the same reports over and over again too.
Lauren, do you have a comment?
Yes, I know it's a conundrum because it's such a big question. And I remember 8 years ago, let's say, when I was teaching at Gunn and talking to the juniors and the seniors about STEM. and access boys and girls into that world and IT. And the girls clearly saying, talking about the drop off. It seems to be the same numbers, equal boys, girls in elementary school, then middle school, and then it just starts dropping off. And the girls, they get isolated. They're just the constant snubs. So I'm wondering and I don't know what you do about it, but I don't know if any of the people on your board, what would you suggest actively that any of us could do to work on those issues, the girl-boy issues, the brown, black, yellow, green, so that there are more people in the community, maybe fighting. How can it overlap with other activist groups so that it's not an isolated movement, but it's seen as a larger cultural movement?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this also builds on a question that's coming in from David Melitzer about how to educate the whole child and start with a focus on ourself, related to your reference of Otto Scharmer.
Who's at MIT, and he studied with Peter Senge, and he's with the Presidency Institute. I'm actually going to go to the end of what popped in my mind for the answer to this question, which is something that I'm nervous about, excited about. It's new territory for me on this learning journey that we started virtually, that was supposed to be at the Multiversity. I wasn't expecting to end up in convergence with Indigenous wisdom. Maybe some of that came about because my good friend Michael Nephew has been part of our work from the beginning, and he's been at all of our summits, and he opened our learning weekend with a blessing to the Four Directions that was in Cherokee. And so maybe the seed was already there. But the quick migration happened because Lisa Matias, who was with MyTax in Canada, that does a partnership between private industry and academia for places for postdocs to go. In Canada, there's been so much energy around First Nations and around reparations and land sovereignty. It's just a very front and central area. So she was really curious to reach out to that community, and we found it was a high level of resonance with our own thinking of the members of this learning community. And we've had some really good discussions about it. I come sort of hat in hand because we're coming up to something that's much older in terms of a way of knowing or a knowledge system, and wanting to do so sort of humbly rather than saying, oh, we want to come learn from you. We're looking at where the space in between is and to partner in some projects just to see what emerges. We also found with the learning community that, surprisingly to me, ultimately we're that group of, it's very, people in high levels in their industries, they actually really wanted to learn more about each other in the end. They wanted to become a deeper community. And I've found that ReImagine Science's work is about relationships more than anything at all. So my answer is we're exploring this new territory between a worldview that encompasses everything and the Western science worldview, which doesn't. It has a limitation. The other place, though, and sort of foreshadowing David's question, is self-knowledge. A way to become powerful in these questions is self-knowledge and then allyship. So self-knowledge, humility, and then creating relationships. So that's my answer. In my current state, that's my answer.
Ever evolving, right?
Yes.
So I think Yahindra also had a question that's a little related, which is on embodied cognition, talking about Anne-Marie Paul's book, The Extended Mind. And he felt you alluded to this in the systems comments that you mentioned. Do you have any thoughts more on embodied cognition?
Yeah. I'm also reading Barbara Tversky's book, Mind in Motion, right now, which is similar. We think outside of our bodies and with our bodies both. We extend our body space into the space where we use tools as well as our own hands and tools set that we're born with. I have two thoughts, not having thought through this lens for very long now, but I have thought through two other lenses that are in this landscape. So one of them is, and again, I'm looking at Medi on the screen here. One of the things I love about 4D mapping out of social presence in theater is that you're thinking with your body, and your body can't lie and it can't think fast enough to do so. So if you're making a sculpture of the system as it is now and where it wishes to go, and you're thinking only through motion, body motion, your mind isn't quick enough to say, oh, I feel like I'm really tight and tense, but I'm supposed to be saying, oh no, I love the President's Council on New Policy, so I should be saying something elegant. You can't think that quickly. You're kind of under pressure and you're moving your body. Your body ends up doing the speaking. And the second area around this, yes, and I know the author of Sand Talk, Jean. The second area that I'm totally in love with, and I'm looking forward to where this new body of knowledge goes, is the PhD work of my friend Louise Livingstone, who has studied the heart as a thinking organ, neurochemically and biologically, and in the neurotransmitters that go back and forth between the brain and the heart. And she has put forward the premise that the heart is actually an organ of imaginal thinking. And it's likely that it's where you think emotionally and where you think through, it's probably connected to where you think through whole vision instead of the sort of linear mechanical thinking that we tend to think of as logical thinking. So there is this whole cognition process that, interestingly enough, comes from scientific inquiry, those who are curious, who are niggling into the system, including niggling in through alternative means. And I'm not talking about microdosing, but I'm thinking more like a meditation and group work that is telling us about these other ways that we think that aren't just this linear word processing that the brain does. So I think it has great promise. So my answer is, I think, yes, there's a lot that can come from marrying science to these other fields of knowledge that actually have a place in science themselves, scientists study.
So I think John was trying to bring up the perspective of how we bring in not just the academic science community, but those of entrepreneurs and corporate America as we sit here in the Valley. So John, go for it.
Yeah, of course, I'm just an engineer looking in from the outside. Having been retired for 25 years, I'm pretty much out of the mainstream. First of all, I liked your one slide showing the siloing of science. And I just finished reading the book about Jennifer Doudna, the Nobel Prize laureate, who, well, the book was basically about how they went after the pandemic, the COVID solution. And you could see in that book the fact, although I think the big pharma was working together better than most, BioNTech and Pfizer kind of did some of the main work. But the problem is that I think maybe the pandemic is one of the only places that I can think of where there was very much cooperation between these massive, armies of people. I was thinking as I read the book, there must have been 1,000 scientists, PhD level scientists working in various parts of the world, because the book basically told about when one little forward breakthrough would happen, then within a week or two, the guys out in Boston would, when Doudna was doing something at Berkeley, something like a week later, the Boston guys would already have done that and maybe were a little ahead. So I saw the cooperation there being pretty outstanding. But I really doubt that happens in hardly any other. It's not like the space program where everybody was on the same page. Again, I'm looking in on your on your organization here and not quite understanding. There's nobody that can really make this happen, it seems to me, until you get the Tim Cooks and the Google boys to somehow bring philosophy into their company culture.
Yeah.
I'll be quiet now.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah, I think you made the point. I'm also sad to see we lost Ken Hallenbeck, who went to great lengths to be here. He just moved into his new house in Connecticut and was having to hang out at his old one to have signal. So I'm trying to get him back on because I'd love him to answer that direction that you just went in, John, but we'll see if he shows up. If he does, I would like to have him speak a few words.
Well, I think also that one comment I had, although it's not my talk, is whether people need to be together physically. So I think that without being sort of sharing the same air is a little harder to make that spiritual connection.
I would love for Mary, if you can, to say something to that.
I'm sorry.
Can you unmute, Mary?
Yes. Sorry, I was trying to unmute and also go to gallery. Hi. Hi, everybody. Hi. I just came, because I love Kennan's work and just kind of to see what she was doing lately because I haven't seen her in a while. But I really like this question about do we have to be together? I have been doing the work of social presence in theater, what Kennan referred to before, online for about, I don't know, way before the pandemic. And a lot of people kind of felt that was, impossible to do. And I found that there were lots and lots of great work that was being done, and the quality of the connection with people was like very much like in person. The other thing is that it wasn't exactly like in person, but it was something else. So I think the problem comes when we try to do the same, right? To bring the in-person into online, and it's impossible. But exploring online is actually and what can be done. I found that it was like 4D mappings or, like different exercises that we do in the social presence in theater work. They all translate really well, because what I find what is important is the connection. And for the connection, I find is what's the willingness in an actual connection. In order to get there, there's a sense of almost like taking off what I think I know and really come to a place of like, what is it that, so come with I don't know, which I find that is a very hard, thing to do. I don't know, because a lot of us know a lot, and a lot of us spend lives, to know something and then to say, I don't know. But there's a different kind of I don't know. And so when everybody comes with that willingness to actually know collectively what it's in there, I think that's what gives the most results. And
Yeah.
I think, I can just stop here, but if you want to know more, I'm happy to talk to anybody.
And that was actually, so that was the workshop that we proposed for Science of Team Science, was how to create trust in a virtual environment. And we based it on our experiment, doing social presence in theater with a group of scientists for a learning journey, using these embodied practices that Mehdi led.
Okay, so another question that's actually, I think, quite something you and I, Kennan, have talked about is funding of this kind of work. I've been very disappointed that there's not a lot of the old way, DARPA style funding of basic research, that kind of thing. Because when I was doing that kind of work, it went to military funding. And whether that kind of basic research can be established again, but for, what I call science, real science work, and not just something that will contribute to bombs and bullets. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
And I think I'm going to point this over to see if, David, if you're still at your camera, if you can hear me. So if he shows back up, I might have him on this too. So yes, I don't have an answer, but this also points to what John was asking about. Paul Allen had started the Institute for, it's not systems biology, I'm blanking, but yeah. And it had, and this was when we were very first starting in the mid 2000s,
Right.
And we were looking for transformative change in science as an industry, and his millions created an institute that created 17 new faculty positions.
Wow.
Now that's great, but it's 17 new jobs. So it's not transformational, it's not scale. If you look at, there's a lot of these startups that are private industry money that are trying to come in and help fix the life sciences. In fact, the launch of Science of Team Science at national academies, they had a number of very wealthy individuals that threw money at the top cardiologists in the country. And in the launch of the Science of Team Science report out of national academies, it's not in the recording now, I think they must have edited, but the lead of that, who was at Stanford, head of cardiology at the time, said, well, we papered up that we had worked together, but we were unable to actually work together. We just individually did our research and put it all into one document. So it's a cultural change that I don't know where the moral courage for that change will come from. In some ways, it's a wicked problem that I probably wouldn't be able to predict where it will come from. But the current funding system and the exponential propagation of PhDs without any mindfulness about where they actually can get hired to do the work they've been trained in over a decade causes so much suffering, and there hasn't been the moral courage to change the policy. So that's why I was so interested in it being over in the complicated section. But there's also David's work on the whole child. I mean, in general, educating our youth so that they can have wonderful lives doing work that's meaningful is a job for society as a whole. And our scientific curiosity in math and abilities to do experiments can absolutely weave in there, but in the current paradigm, I think it doesn't have a place. I find people go into science, and I've seen it over and over again over my career, and either mentoring others or watching them, and they're doing all the right things, and they get that PhD and they're top of their class, and they leave science. And when I started, Richard Freeman, who's with the National Bureau of Economic Research at Harvard, said 60% of PhDs will leave science altogether for lack of work. So I think this is actually tied to what are we doing with our youth in general. So David, do you have any thoughts on this, on billionaires saving science versus what's actually needed in society?
I think we as people ourselves are lost in that debate. And because we're not really focusing on what our own experience is. How do we make meaning of the world? And what we have is the present moment in our presence. That's what we have. That's what we can work with. And to the degree that we're supporting our kids to be in that space, I mean, it just feels essential right now because there's so much unknown. And there's so much denial. And there's so much being revealed. I don't know, is that am I addressing your?
Well, and when you say revealed, I will just add, just because a hint of where I know you're almost certainly coming from. One of the conversations that I had that wasn't pertaining to my work, but a good friend from the TED Summit, putting together a TEDx up in Canada, and about a year and a half ago, he had me speak with a young astronomer who's First Nation, and we were having this really in-depth exploration around whether Western science and indigenous wisdom should be equals. And I said, I really think Western science is actually enveloped in indigenous wisdom, because indigenous wisdom is a way of looking at the whole. And it has that whole person and also whole living beings for non-human beings as well in it. And I think, David, you're alluding to that kind of viewpoint as well.
There really is a overlapping of wisdom from our ancestors, from our own indigenous cultures, which are here today, to our own experiences and to our own experience of what the future can be. So we need to value that. People I'm reading are trying to unpack that in new ways, which is really encouraging. But it's well out of the mainstream thinking. You're right.
Yeah.
So Jahendra has many references and lists in the chat. So I wonder if he would like to say anything about those, because he's been very diligent about communicating in the chat. So would you like to comment on that, please?
Thank you, Joy. Love the answers you both have given, Kennan and David. There is a lot of depth to it, and something that gives us pause to think through, because Silicon Valley is on its own path of a runaway train, and we need to understand and zoom out and see the big picture for what it is. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. You should look in the chat to see some of the references he's put in there, which are really good and helpful for us all. So I think we're getting close to the end of the time slot that we have. But Jean, you've also contributed some wonderful book as well that she'd read. Jean, do you want to say anything about that book, Sand Talk?
Stanley Krippner and I took a trip to Rice University, and we were both reading at the same time. So I've been exposed to a lot of academics lately. Of course, they're brilliant, but there are thinkers and there are doers. And right now we need some action. As you know, there's the army, and then there's the leaders. And so we're thinkers, and we're looking at all these different ways that we can do stuff, but we just got to really connect with other people outside of these silos between Silicon Valley, medicine, entertainment. Right now, it seems like kids are, it's edutainment is how they're learning.
Yeah.
And I hear that Meta is working on getting into the schools, but then that's just their perspective. Leaves a lot of people out.
Yeah.
So if we can each help physically one person, we can make a difference in one person's life, a real tangible, practical difference. And then things start to shift. But what we're talking about is important.
Yeah, thanks, Jean. I think the last kind of wrap-up question is also encapsulated by Tom saying, like, what would you like people today to participate and do? And I think that's really what Jean just said, is can we at least affect one person? Tom, do you want to say anything more about that?
I'm interested in what Kennan has to say in particular with regard to supporting the overall effort that she's spearheading.
Yeah. And Tom, it's a very direct question, and I'm going to answer it. I don't know if I'll be as direct in my answer, but one, Tom specifically, your passion, Tom, over many years around your own science and getting it out is one thing that I really treasure and I respect greatly. And Tom has also, he does a direct outcomes, and though I don't think it's direct outcomes, that's specifically the mapping that we did.
The name of the book is Create Crucial Insight.
Crucial Insights,
not necessarily relevant here.
Well, it is, because this idea of looking at all of the lost potential that's left on the table is a really key insight going through the process that Tom had walked me through several years ago. So I think I'm going to bifurcate my answer. So one is, indeed, I'm looking for where moral courage can come from. And we do have a project that I would love anybody that's really passionate about it that might help create the team that gets under our wings. Our third space events have been very productive when we do them. They're interactive dialogues that we do in the community of interest. So universities are one of our strong points there. And I would love to have a documentary because the amount of dysfunction in the system is easy to ignore or not know. But to get the kind of moral courage needed for actual policy change, we need something that touches the heart through true vision. And so getting that vision out there, I think, will be critical. And I'm not sure how to do that, but that's one project that we've had in the wings for a while now that COVID sort of got in the way of, plus my own demands in my own life. The other one is Lynn Twist has a recent interview where she brings up the idea of grandmother energy. And I'm a grandmother now. And I'm getting to live right by where my grandson is. And the thing that can be done individually in terms of what I see as grandmother energy is to each person sort of respect the quieter energy in the community that you're part of, to really respect what you yourself are doing and what those quieter voices are doing on just taking care of the day-to-day work and taking care of the caring. Even Toffler called it the third estate, which is the estate that's not the paid estate. It's not monetized, but it's caringitized. It's the actual care, and that's the natural system. When I've given this talk in policy areas, I say, when we have a baby, we don't look at the baby and say, how much money will you make for me during your life? We look at the baby and we nurture it to grow and thrive. We need to do that with our population, with our youth, with our children that are in school, with our families. We need to have that kind of energy. And that's in each and every one of you can bring that lens into your own looking and your own circumstances and system and a part of society that you're a member of.
I want to throw something in, and that is document success cases and failure cases and have a central repository so you can pick things to do and things not to do.
Yeah, we're actually working in Science of Team Science. I've gotten a lot of traction with that community. It's changed its tone over the years, and it's just a lovely community. And we're doing a mapping the competencies needed for team science right now. And one of the lenses we're looking through is failures. Where are the big failures in these really large funded projects? And what are the competencies that could have gotten past those failures? So
Great.
So we've got someone suggesting that they'd like to do a documentary with you, which sounds like a really great output from this meeting that we're having today, where we want something to contribute to at this point. So thanks, Jean, for doing that. And I think it's a good time to wrap up, unless anyone has a burning question. Moyana, did you have a burning question?
I have one thing that I would like to add, just as an extension to what everybody's been saying, and to Kennan's mention of wicked problems or complex systems problems. But then on the other hand, the individual going within and becoming more self-aware. And the one other piece of this is that IT gives us this crowdsourcing capability where many people with many points of view can become part of creating the story, a story of which, each has a separate part. And I think that distributed knowledge building is a big contribution that IT can make, and a big contribution that then we all could make by going within and figuring out what our stories are and how they contribute to complex systems problems. Not,
yeah, well put.
One and the other separate.
Well put. So thank you, Kennan, for bringing us to a very deep set of important questions and profound ideas. So
I think Brianna wanted to say something.
I just wanted to acknowledge and thank you, Kennan, for such a deep and provocative, profoundly important topic that I have maybe in some unconscious and grandmotherly ways also contemplated. I share your grandmother energy. And I believe that some kind of a documentary or something, a visionary that can really bring this to a much wider audience and understanding would be incredibly powerful. And in any way that I might be able to help and contribute in that would be, certainly I would be willing to do that. And I just thank you so much for this really, really important and significant presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Boyan. That was lovely to hear. Thank you.
So I think she expresses all of our thoughts. Very provocative, very impactful, and very, very genuinely felt by all of us. Thank you very much, Kennan. And lots of clapping. And I don't have the grandmotherly feel, but it was very impactful to me too. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Bill, for bringing us together quarterly, and all the participants too, because it doesn't work if there aren't participants. So thank you all so much for joining us.
And I want to thank Joy. She's an absolutely spectacular host to whatever she.
Hostess.
Yeah,
Thank you. And we'll look forward to talking to you someday soon, okay? Thank you, Kennan. You did a wonderful job.
Thanks, Ken.
Very special. Very special.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.